Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Charlotte Mason Show. I'm your host, Julie Ross, and I'm here again with the amazing Shay Kemp.
Hello.
Yes, we're here to discuss chapter 9. And both of us have had quite the week, so I feel like my reason isn't that great. So today we're going to be discussing reason. So, yes.
I know.
Be interesting.
This is a powerful chapter, though. Not very long, but very, very powerful. So many great things in here.
Oh my gosh, I know. I'm so excited. So, Shay, do you want to read principles 18 and 19 that she starts with here?
Of course.
I can see.
So it says, we should teach children also not to lean too confidently unto their own understanding, because the function of reason is to give logical demonstration of A, mathematical truth, and B, of initial ideas accepted by the will. In the former case, reason is, perhaps, an infallible guide, but in the latter, it is not always a safe one. For whether the initial idea be right or wrong, reason will confirm it by irrefragable proofs. So I had to look that word up just in case.
That's a fun word to say. Yeah,
I looked it up.
Good job with that, by the way.
Therefore, children should be taught as they become mature enough to understand such teaching that the chief responsibility which rests upon them as persons is the acceptance or rejection of ideas presented to them. To help them in this choice, we should afford them principles of conduct and a wide range of fitting knowledge.
You did such a good job with that.
Lots of great information in that. Just reading the principle is so full of things to think about, much less the things that she wrote about it in this chapter.
So we have there's two principles there. First one is principle 18, that we're not to teach our children to rely too much on reason, that we showed them that reason is great for mathematics, and that's really simple to understand. Like, yes. 2 + 2 is 4. Like, there's a definite answer in mathematics. You can reason, especially when you get up into higher level math, those reasoning skills,
geometry,
and solving proofs in geometry are so important, right? And there's a logical step-by-step way to do that. The second thing that we need our reasoning for is kind of to accept or reject these ideas that our will is giving to us, or kind of sometimes prop up the reasons that the will is trying to do something. And then principle 19 is that we are trying to teach our children that they have a moral responsibility to accept or reject ideas, and that the way that we teach them to kind of wrestle with these ideas is by giving them this wide range of knowledge.
Yes.
So that's the summary there of those two things. And it really does relate to the chapter we just did, chapter 8 on the will. So if you haven't listened to that podcast or you haven't read chapter 8, you could just stop this right now and come back later, because the will is kind of like the gatekeeper here of what ideas we accept or reject into our hearts and to our minds. And then our reason is what propels us to keep those ideas or reject them. So you have to kind of marry the two together, if that makes sense. I don't know. How would you describe that?
I just think it's so important, because to understand the will before you get to reason, because without understanding the will, like she says in this chapter, we can formulate a reason for any of our actions, whether good or bad. So the idea of having a will that is rightly directed, helps us understand this concept of reason and how it can be rightly or wrongly directed.
Right. Yeah. So, reason is like the yes man. So once it'll prove whatever the will has decided. So we need to train the will to make good decisions. And then the reason will follow. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. 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 And so she says in here, reasoning is a great servant, but a terrible master.
I know, I copied that down. I love that. Yes.
We want to train our children that you have the power to make reason suit you for good, and not let it just go, because we're naturally going to go with our lusts, with our appetite, with the things that, are selfish and the things that help us. And because God has given us such great reasoning, like you're saying, we can use it to kind of justify just about any wrong action we want to take.
That's right. And that's one of the things that can make, I think what she's saying here, an interesting prospect for parents, because we are allowing our children, like she says, letting children work out the arguments in favor of this or that conclusion. We're not just saying to our children, you should do this with your reason. You should, that is
what you should think.
Right.
Here's what your opinion should be.
Right.
And it's scary because we want to control that. We think by controlling the reasoning, we will get the right action.
Yes.
And she's saying it's the reverse of that. It's the right action, and then your reason will work its way through that.
Right. And that's why I love throughout this chapter, she has multiple examples. And she starts, of course, with Macbeth, the great general, and uses that as an example. And then she goes through men and women of history and uses those as examples. And the fact that they are real people who struggled and wrestled, like you said, with real situations, real ideas, sometimes reasoning in ways that came to conclusions that worked out for positive, and sometimes reasoning and coming to conclusions that worked out for negative. But because they're realistic examples, it gives our children the opportunity to, like she says, ask. It is worthwhile to ask a child, how did you think of it? Mm-hmm. And because we're allowing them to read these books and see these things in history of people who ask that same question of themselves, how did I come to this conclusion? And maybe not spelled out that way, but by reading about their lives and seeing what they choose in different examples, then it brings it home to the child that we can say, how did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, it's great. She kind of gives us 4 ways that I saw that she said we can kind of train the reason here. The first, like you're saying, is with like everyday objects and things, Yes. Oh, I wonder, how that got invented, or I wonder why somebody thought we needed one of those, or, oh, tell me about this Lego tower that you made. What made you think, oh, you should put that there, and especially like young children, just getting them curious and thinking beyond just the normal observation of like, oh, that's a cool truck, like getting them to kind of start reasoning and thinking through. And that's a great way for little children to kind of start to express those ideas to you, so that later on, when they're reading Macbeth, they're used to dissecting and kind of talking about those things. And like you're saying, then the next tool that she gives us is finding fallacies through our liberal arts. Like she's like, math and grammar are covered. Okay. They're going to learn reasoning in this subject.
Yeah.
But why are you laughing, Shay? I know why you're laughing, I think.
One reason I'm laughing is because I feel like people stress over those things so much.
Yes.
They stress over math and grammar so much, and we get so many questions about those 2 particular things. But when you read this chapter, she's like, right? Basically math and grammar are handled. We know that those are going to follow rules and they're going to follow laws. We know that. You just have to learn them. But yeah, I love that because we get so many questions about that. I was trying to find the quote.
Yeah, me too.
That. Yeah, I think it's
because if you are struggling with math or grammar, I want you to read this chapter. Because she will make you feel better. She's like, these things are going to take care of themselves, and we probably don't actually need to put as much time and effort into them as we are. Because really, at the end, this concept of the liberal arts and the ideas and the things that they're growing as a person from these are more important. Not that we're going to neglect those subjects, but they can't take the prime importance in our education, which they often tend to do. Yeah, we'll have to find that one. I'm using a different copy today. So
here's one quote that's at the end. It says,
I found it.
Did you go ahead and read it?
Perhaps we should postpone parsing, for instance, until a child is accustomed to weigh sentences for their sense. Should let them daily with figures of speech before we attempt minute analysis, and should reduce our grammatical nomenclature to a minimum. I mean, there's so many terms. I was so aggravative with my child. She's like, oh, Mom, I need a reflexive pronoun. I'm like, what? I'm like, we don't ever use these things in real life. I forget what they're called.
Why do you need a reflexive program? whatever that was.
For the work. Yeah, for the assignment. I'm like, we don't use these things, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I just think that's why I was laughing because, she says perhaps we should postpone parsing, and for instance, until a child is accustomed to weigh sentences for their sense. And, we can't weigh those sentences for the actual sense that's in them until we have learned to understand the reason, understand the role of our own reason. So,
yeah, she says, yet few children take pleasure in grammar. So if your kids don't like it, you don't like it. Like, hey, Charlotte's saying you're in the majority here.
That's right.
Especially in English grammar. Maybe like Latin grammar is more exciting. I'm not sure what she's referring to here, but
I don't know.
And then she says, arithmetic, again, mathematics, appeal only to a small percentage of a class or school. And for the rest, however intelligent, its problems are baffling to the end, though they may take delight in reasoning out problems of life in literature and history. Can I get an amen?
Yes, amen. Hallelujah. Yes.
That was me in school. That's me now teaching my kids. I'm like, this is baffling to the end, people. What is happening in these problems? I don't understand. But
why do we need to know this? It's like,
reason out literature, history. I'll do that all day long.
Yes, that's right. I just think it's funny that she makes that point, and people ask that all the time. Is this enough grammar? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So we got those covered. Okay. And then she's saying the other way that we can teach reasoning is through our humanities, the liberal arts. She refers back to the medieval education and very high focus on these liberal arts. And she's saying through that, we can teach them to kind of look through fallacies. So you mentioned Macbeth, and she points that out here. We see him go from like a really good king to a murderer. And the whole time throughout all of his speeches, he's totally rationalizing his behavior, right? And, but his reasoning, the methods he uses are sound logic, is kind of like her point that she's going at here, Right. And then she goes through Marxist manifesto, which again is just showing how brilliant this woman is, right? And she goes through all of like 10 arguments that he has in his manifesto and just like annihilates them. Like
she does. I was so impressed with this when I read it.
She could have been a poli-sci major or something, right?
I've read this chapter before, but I have to be perfectly honest. I think I probably skipped that section just because I was like, oh, no, never mind. I'm not interested in that. So this time I really read it much more deeply. Yes. And the way that she breaks it down is so powerful. And of course, we're not going to take the time to go through all that politics, but I love the fact that she says point by point, for good or for evil, she takes the time to use her own reasoning and use it as an example.
Right. Yes, right.
And it speaks to how widely read and intelligent she was. This is not somebody that just came up with some ideas and did not apply them in her own life to the things that are going on around her. She did apply them to the things that were going on in her own self-education. And I love that. This stuff works for a grown-up.
Oh, yeah.
Looking at
I don't know about you, but the whole time I'm thinking, I think there are a lot more grown-ups need to read this chapter just for their own personal lives, because the stuff you see on Facebook, it's like, maybe some reasoning would be helpful to support what it is that you're saying, even if I don't agree with you. But can you logically do that? And I think our society now is so emotionally charged that they use emotions to make a point rather than reason to make a point.
Right. And that's why this section is beautiful, because she does point out the fallacies in each of the points. She goes through, and rather than saying, I don't agree with that, which is what I feel like we get, like you said, a lot of now.
Or can you believe anybody thinks that?
Right.
Or those people are wrong. It's like, well, why?
Yes. And she so clearly goes through without making a statement about the people that follow that. Right. She's not doing that. What she's doing is she's saying, here are the reasons that this point is not going to function properly. Right. And, it's the same thing that makes me think that you talked about. She begins with the idea of everyday items. She says, there is no object in use, great or small, upon which some man's reason has not worked exhaustively. A sofa, a chest of drawers, a ship. She goes on example. So what happens is we a lot of times we stop that there and we don't realize that carries through. If somebody built a chair and it had 3 legs on it, you and I would look at it and we would say, if I sit in that chair, it will fall. And the reason is because there's only 3 legs. It will not hold me the way those 3 legs are built.
Right.
And I think she so skillfully in this chapter takes that idea and expands it onto ideas and concepts that are as deep and as thick as this manifesto. Why does this point only stand on 3 legs?
Mm-hmm.
Right? She brings it down. So it's just the same idea, but expanded.
Yeah, I love that. And she says, in her days, the air is full of fallacies. And she says it makes us willing to accept conclusions duly supported by public opinion or by those whose opinions we value. And I was like, oh man, you could just see Instagram today. Like it is the world that we live in is so
just
based on public opinion and the opinions of people we value. And I think that can be one of the dangers of a traditional education system, or even in homeschooling, where it's we want, we're telling our children what to think, or the teacher's telling them what to think, and they're not having the opportunity to think through these kind of reasoning and fallacies. And so then they're so swayed by everybody else because they've never learned the skill, which is so vital, and it's scary. And she's saying that, in the early 1900s, and,
it's so the same today. And one thing that I was thinking about for myself is it's so easy for us to choose resources and materials that only back up what our own perspective, our own point of view, our own way of seeing things.
Yeah.
So when we are considering this, she says, after abundant practice in reasoning and tracing out the reasons of others, whether in fact or fiction, children may readily be brought to the conclusions that reasonable and right are not synonymous terms. That reason is their servant, not their ruler. One of those servants which help man's soul in the governance of his kingdom. So if I'm only providing things that back up my own personal opinion, I'm only allowing stories. I'm only allowing, and I'm not saying we put things out there in front of our children that are not appropriate. So, I'm saying that we show them people that struggle with these ideas, wrestle with these ideas, maybe slip and fall before they find their footing.
Yeah. No, I think this is so key because we get these questions all the time, right? Like, what is your view on this historical event? Or what is your view on this historical person? Or does your curriculum, we're going to get rid of all the books that have any reference to blah, 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 blah.
Yes.
And I'm like, no. I want things to be, appropriate for our time. I want appropriate terms for people that we now use. But I also want them to see, okay, this is what people thought back then.
Yes.
What was their reasoning for saying those things that they said back then? What is their reasoning? What's our reasoning for thinking different now? To be able to look at a person and go, well, they did these things that were good, these things that weren't so great. So again, and we talked about this before, but it's just so important because I'm teaching history at my co-op this year, and we just did Columbus this week. You want to talk about like everybody's got an opinion one way or another about that dude, right? And it was like, I said to my kids, I'm like, people aren't all good or all bad, and I am not going to tell you what to think. We're going to read different sources.
Yes.
We're going to take a look at what people have said, his own journals. You come to your own conclusion and tell me why. You need to be able to support why you think what you think about it.
Yes.
As long as you can port. And then I read this chapter for today's podcast. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so what she's talking about. Like, exactly. And even if I don't necessarily agree with them, this is the hard part, right? Mm-hmm. To go, okay, I could see why you might think that, or, oh, that's an interesting way to, come to that conclusion or whatever. Let them have that space.
And that's why parents,
eventually their opinion might change too. They might, just like our opinions have grown, as we learn more things and more things happen in the world. And, that's always changing, but we have to allow our kids the freedom to not go, you must fit into this one box and your opinion must agree with my opinion on everything.
And that's why parents get afraid when you talk about, there's a, well, what if they come to a different conclusion? Or what if, you know, what if I don't agree with what they said? Or what if I can't explain? But we don't have to be able to explain. You know, they need to find their own reasons. And that's why narration is so much more powerful than comprehension questions. And why I think these, you know, we're talking about principles, yes, but ultimately comes down to the, what are we doing around the dining room table for school every day? And that's the why behind some of the methods. We allow them to narrate because we want them to tell us what they took away instead of, you know, what did this person do? Or what was this? These simple lower level thinking skill questions.
Right.
We're asking them to reach up into these parts of your brain where connections are made and start to struggle with that themselves. And, you know, it takes time.
Yes.
And the outcome does not always look like what the outcome's going to look like. They might tell you something completely different than what you thought was important.
Right.
But that's part of the beauty of it.
Right. Yes. And I think she made a good point. She says we must be able to answer the arguments in the air, not so much by counter reasons, but by exposing the fallacies in such arguments and proving on our own part the opposite position. So,
yes, that's a great point.
Yeah. So, and I think today people will get very much caught up in defending their own position.
Yes. Yes.
Rather than being able to listen, be curious, and then expose the fallacies in someone else's logic or reasoning, you know?
Yes.
And again, that's a much higher level thinking skills. And like you're saying, you can't get that from basic recall kind of questions that will never come. You know, you have to be able to narrate, put things into your own words, make those connections. That higher level thinking will come from that. And it will also come from reading books with living ideas. So, you know, reading a textbook, you're not going to come up with like, oh, I would think that is a good thing and that is wrong. You know, even today we were reading stories from the history of Rome, which is why she includes subjects like Plutarch in her lessons, you know. And you know, the two sons try to rebel and he beheads them, you know. And you're like, this is really gruesome and violent. I probably should not expose my children to these terrible things. Now, again, my kids are, you know, the youngest is in 6th grade now, so it's not like, you know, I'm reading this to my kindergartner, but you know, still, it's like, you know, maybe we shouldn't read this stuff. This, you know, they might be violent or whatever. I don't know. But, you know, they're like, that's horrible. Like, he didn't stand up for his own sons, blah, 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 blah. And then my other child's like, well, you know, like, they were trying to overthrow him. Like, what should the punishment have been? You know, like, he couldn't maintain order, blah, blah, blah. So they're thinking, you know, like, that's the key. It was like, yes, there's something here to wrestle with, right? It speaks to a part of us as humans that go, ooh, I don't know how I feel about that.
And when we get the questions about how do I know if a book is a living book or not, and there's 5 million zillion debates about that. I don't, you know, we're not going to go down that road. But I will tell you the one thing that sort of helps me if I'm looking for something is there something to wrestle with in these stories?
That's good.
And of course, she talks about ideas over and over again. And of course, we've talked about that on this podcast multiple times, but we want living ideas to feed their minds as the food of their minds. But practically what that can look like is if you read a story and the characters are all one-sided, and
they all never make wrong choices.
They're right. There's nothing like you never have a question. Even the books I read for myself that are fictional, they're just like for fun. The ones I enjoy are the ones where maybe a character does something completely unexpected, which is how life is. Right. And I'm like, wow, why did they do that? Or what would have been a better choice? And if those are the kinds of things that you're asking yourself as you're reading the book and not just like, well, I knew that was going to happen. Probably not as much of a living book. We want something there that they can wrestle with, be engaged by, that surprises us because this is what real life looks like. And ultimately, we want children that carry these reasoning skills outside of it. And she talks about that because she says, reason, like the other powers of the mind, requires material to work upon.
Yes.
Whether embalmed in history and literature or afloat with the news of a strike or uprising, because she's referring to current events. It is madness to let children face a debatable world with only, say, a mathematical preparation. If our business were to train their power of reasoning, such a training would no doubt be of service, but The power is already there and only wants material to work upon. So whatever you're providing for them needs to be something that their power of reasoning can work upon. And a flat textbook that already tells you what to think, it already tells you the facts and figures, it already tells you exactly, well, this is what happened, this is what happened, and this is, this is the map, so you can do that. There is nothing for your power of reasoning to work upon in that text. And that's why we don't provide those sorts of things.
Right. And not that like she's saying, not that a mathematical preparation is bad.
Oh,
That's
yes,
great, right?
We have
But
to have it.
you have to have, yes, and but that can't be the primary focus. And a lot of that is the big push, the STEM. We're going to spend all this time doing these things, and we're going to ignore what is actually going to shape the person and help them think through things. Even in mathematics, you need that. And again, this is why she includes current events in her program too. So you can get this through Shakespeare. You get this in Plutarch. You get this in literature, like Macbeth. You get this in history, like she's talking about the historical figures. You get this in government and econ, like she's talking about the Marxism. And you definitely get that in current events. And so I'll include this in the show notes. I just started this year, got a subscription to World Watch News. And so it's like 10 minutes. And it's like a Christian news program. So everything's, and I found all the stories are very neutral, which I really appreciate because, again, I don't want to tell my kids what to think about an issue. So I want them to hear, and that's so hard to find in the news, right? A neutral, here's what happened, the end of the story, right? And it's been great because then afterward, like, okay, well, what did you think about that event? Why do you think Russia is closing the pipeline? That was today's news story. Why do you think Russia is closing the pipeline to Germany? What will the effect be if they don't have enough energy to put the heat on in Europe in the winter? Will they change their mind about, we had these great discussions about what's happening in current events. And I also really love too, as a history teacher, I'm always like, history repeats itself. So it's like, has something like this ever happened before? And trying to get them to go, oh, well, that reminds me of this event that happened.
Connections.
We're talking about the Spanish Inquisition in my history class, and I was like, does this remind you of anything, like neighbor turning each other in, and people getting arrested without a trial or without any real evidence of wrongdoing, and I was trying to get like Secret Service World War II, and one kid raised his hand. He's like, yeah, it's like Dolores Umbridge in Harry Potter. And I was like, that's exactly right, actually.
That's true.
But it's, again, that's a higher level connection there, and that's meaningful.
Yes.
And now he's going to remember this, but again, seeing those patterns is part of that reasoning. And in young children, because you might be like, okay, well, I only have like Form 1 kids. We're obviously not going to read Macbeth or, debate Marxist philosophy. So like, what am I going to do with my little kid? And I feel like that's why she brings in fairy tales. And I know people have strong, like some people are like, oh no, we can't. Those things are violent. And again, like you're saying, your kids and what they can handle and can't handle and what you want to include. But that does teach little children be able to think, well, why did Jack take the bee? And maybe, why did this thing happen? And what was his reasoning? And thinking,
you can do it with
her imagination at the same time. She doesn't want to build like reasoning robots here. And I think that's really key too, because people are like, oh, we need to focus on reason. So I'm going to get a bunch of logic books and we're going to do all these logic exercises and I'm going to teach them speech and debate. And not any of those things are bad. Those are great skills, right? Rhetoric, so important. But if that becomes that's the way you're teaching reasoning and you're not teaching reasoning through these living ideas, then that's not okay. It can't be separated out. They need to be together. And she's saying, we don't want to get rid of imagination and wonder. She said, children should be brought up too to perceive that a miracle is not less a miracle because it occurs so constantly and regularly that we call it a law, that sap rises in a tree, that a boy is born with his uncle's eyes, that an answer that we can perceive comes to our serious prayers. These are not the less miraculous because they happen frequently. So we don't want reason to take away the imagination and the wonder. And the way that we do that is by keeping these ideas in our children's minds.
Yes. It's so important for the little ones, I think, to be provided the opportunity to wrestle with those things in a protected way. And
Yes.
that's why I think fairy tales are so important,
Yes.
because they do get to be introduced to these concepts that are real out in the world: good, bad, evil, bad people, good people, people that make bad choices and good choices. And they're not ready to handle that in the real world. We would never give, like, you're not going to give a first grader a current event that's going to be about something scary, right? Okay. But what you can do is take that same concept, like you're saying, in a fairy tale or a folk tale, and it's the same concept, but it's protected.
Yeah, the good guy always
Not real.
yeah.
It's clearly not real. It's clearly not real. Clearly not going to frighten them,
Yes,
but
right.
allow them to start understanding that we do live in a black, gray, and white world. It's all mixed up together, but it's in a protected way, and I love that.
Yeah, yeah. I love that she includes that too. One of the things I thought was hilarious in here, she talks about with older children going through crimes and how criminals can rationalize and justify their behavior, looking for the fallacies in their reasoning. I was like, so we can watch Criminal Minds all day and call it school. I love this. Thank you, Charlotte.
You can listen to all the murder podcasts that you want, all the first.
I have two kids that are super into crime shows, super. And I'm like, is that okay? Is that weird? Like, my one daughter actually almost switched her major to criminal justice. I'm like, we aren't getting any more classes. No.
I have a kid taking forensics this year. She's taking forensics.
Yeah, my daughter took forensic chemistry in college because
Yeah.
she needed a science class, and she's like, well, this sounds the most interesting. And I was like, really? That's creepy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Crazy. It's crazy. She's so fascinated by it. She's only been in class a couple of weeks, and she's just fascinated by it. But I do love this. And I also think it goes to show that, nothing new is under the sun. I mean,
Right.
this is the,
Charlotte Mason was cool. Like, she's like, yeah, let's look at some like serial killers thinking here and talk about how. I'm like, this is before crime documentaries were actually a thing, Charlotte. Like, where were you getting these reports from?
I have no idea. But I do think it's funny that, she obviously understood, and it's so easy for us to ignore, is that we can very easily make a very strong case for whatever bad decision we are going to make. And so if we know that we are capable of that we can easily make a poor decision based on a great reasoning, then if we help our children understand that when they do come up to these crossroads, I have 3 that have grown and gone. And when they come up to these crossroads, they're certainly not going to call mom and say, what's the right decision here? But that they've wrestled with the fact that I can make a good point for a good decision or a bad decision. I can back up either of these decisions. So that's why she's saying, I love this one phrase here. She says, when she's talking about making these choices, she says, we're telling our children in a word, I want, am made for, and must have a God. I want to put that on my wall.
Yeah.
And so when we're raising them with that understanding of the divine creator and with the divine teacher, and she talks about, religion and what that really looks like. I love that she says, if we wish children to keep clear of all the religious clamors in the air, we must help them to understand what religion is. And this is her, after a page or so, this is her summary. I want, and made for, and must have a God. That is what we're not going to tell them, your religion tells you must make this decision, because we cannot ever understand what crossroads they're going to come up to.
Right.
But if we help them to understand that when they bank up against those crossroads, where are they going to make that choice? And not only that, I don't want to be, as a parent, responsible for telling my children what is the right choice in these situations when they're grown, because I'm not in their shoes.
Right. Oh, and that's so hard to let that go.
Yes, it's so
hard to lose that controlling part when they're little. We can control. Okay, well, you made the wrong choice, so now you get to have 5 minutes of timeout, and we are so controlling that. And when they're older, and we have to let them kind of make the decisions that we might not agree with at all.
That's right.
and trust that it's going to work its way out. If it's, they have that training and they're going to choose that path, and this is part of their story, and to just go, I'm here for you and I support you. And yeah, you want to talk through that? No. Okay. Well, I'm still here for you. Like, I mean, and letting that go is like,
yeah. And that's why, though, I think it's important, when you have littles, it's hard to project your mind that far in advance. You
right.
can imagine that. But we do get them to wrestle with those things, like we're talking about this young age, because they are going to be in that place one day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so we're thinking about that end goal of children who are able to reason to something that will have a positive result, but also no, we can't be the ones, just like I don't tell them what to narrate. We can't be the ones to dictate that.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
You touched on 2 points here that I want to go back to. So there's 4 ways that we can instruct them in this reasoning. She says the first one is with these everyday objects, these questions, the curious conversations we have with our little people. The second is teaching them how to trace fallacies in other people's reasoning, for good or for bad, through your current events, your history, your literature, through Bible study and whatnot. And then the third way we can do that is by gently, and by gently, I mean really gently, pointing out the fallacies in their thinking, right? Because sometimes when we point them out, they kind of persist even more that they're right, and this is why they're right, and don't you tell me I'm wrong, So you have to be very, very cautious and careful with that. But it does help for you to point that out gently sometimes. And it does help if they see that, like, other people also had fallacies in their reasoning. Alexander the Great, well, here's the reason why he justified blah, 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 blah. He was able to do these great things, but that thinking wasn't that great. Maybe my thinking sometimes isn't always 100% true either. And teach them to start questioning their thinking is a huge skill. And then the fourth one is instruct them in timeless truths. So that's what we're talking about with the scriptures here, teaching them, to have that biblical worldview, that foundation, not, you going, this is, you must think
realistically
about it. Right.
Right. Yes.
But just instructing them in the truth and showing them what is beautiful and what is good constantly before them. And we also train them and caution them against these 2 things. The first one was idle propositions and then blasphemy, she said. So idle propositions, basically, they rest on nothing and they lead to nothing. There's nothing to them. There's no foundation to that. And that's, again, what we see all the time. So we're going to really have to teach our kids to recognize that. Like, there's nothing backing that up. That's just someone's opinion or someone's emotion, or someone is angry about whatever and they're ranting. That is not actually a well thought through argument. And then, blasphemy being, impudent towards God. So that, we can get lost in the muddle sometimes of the minute points of scripture, and we lose the big picture. The big picture is the heart, right? And the heart.
Yes.
And she said
that one statement she made.
Oh, do you have it?
I am made for, and I must have a God. That, love that.
Mic drop. Thank you, Charlotte.
Yes, right.
I think that's kind of like going back to the verse in Philippians, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely. Think about these things. We are instructing our kids in truth, beauty, and goodness, and showing them that picture. And that will also help develop their reasoning and their affections towards those things. So, one last quote that I love, and then I want your closing thoughts here. She says, and this is just, again, maybe you could cross-stitch this on a pillow for me, Shay, because I love this quote.
I could embroider it for you. You tell me what you want.
The business of teachers is to open as many doors as possible.
Oh.
Isn't that beautiful?
It's so beautiful. I just love it so much. And and she says very similarly, what I marked as like a main point is her quote that says, for ourselves and for our children, it is enough to know that reason will put a good face on any matter we propose. And that we can prove ourselves to be in the right is no justification. For there's absolutely no theory we may receive, no action we may contemplate, which our reason will not affirm.
Mm.
So that's why we have to be a teacher that opens all these doors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To show them these people that said, oh, well, their reasoning justified this, and they murdered this person.
Yeah, right.
And their reason justified this,
right.
And they started a war, right?
Right.
And their reason justified this, but look at the beauty that came from that. The trick is that we don't moralistically point that out, and it's very hard. I find it very hard for myself, even. We're reading about Napoleon right now, and I find myself very much wanting to make points that my sixth grader does not notice yet. The connections are being like, did you not see how, blah, blah, Yeah. But I'm opening the doors, right? Like you said, I'm the teacher, opening the doors.
Yes, I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I hope that was helpful for people. And again, I just really hope that this encourages you. If you're struggling with some of these kind of subjects and, you want to feel the need to censor everything that lines up with the way you think things happened or the way that things should be explained, to allow your child to read things that have both sides, for you to be able to do that, and develop your kind of reasoning and talk to people that are different than you and explore that so that your children can have that opportunity as well. And it really is a leap of faith, but it's so beautiful to see. And again, it's going to be so beneficial for them in their life to be able to realize my will go for good or for ill, and my logic will back that up and be able to question their own thinking. And for you as well, because sometimes, things seem so true to us. And we think, oh, my child's struggling with blah, 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 or I'm failing as a mom because of blah, 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 blah. And we don't ever question our own thinking either to go, is that 100% true all the time?
Yes. Right. And we can really, I think this is why I love the philosophy. I love the methods. I love homeschooling, is because I'm growing along with my child when I open myself up to that. And they're not only seeing it through, like you said, the 4 different ways, but they're watching an adult. I used to think grown-ups had everything figured out. I was naturally going to hit 30 and get it figured out, right? But they're watching. I don't know where I got that from. That's what I thought. And then I got to about 26. I'm like, 4 years is not going to do this for me. It's not going to happen in 4 years. But they're watching an adult be willing to struggle with these ideas. Well, I really thought this, but now that I read this book about this particular thing, I'm thinking there's some other ways to think about that. Or I listened to this particular podcast about maybe a current event, and I'm thinking something else. And so they're watching a grown-up be open to struggle with these same things and to consider my own reason, like she said, to go to God and be based on those, truths, and go back to that and say, okay, where does that back this up? Where does it not? How does my own thinking need to change? And that's just as important as any book that, we as a teacher would open the door to our children, is the living that we're doing in front of them.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thanks, friend. And I look forward to talking with you about chapter 10.
All right. Next time.
Bye,